Hey family, welcome to Mr. Gray Family, where every story begins with us. My husband said I was easy to replace. Sandra Johnson would replay those 7 words in her mind so many times that she eventually opted counting. Not because they were loud, not because they were shouted. The truth was much worse. They had been spoken casually, almost carelessly, as if the woman who spent years helping build a dream was nothing more than a temporary employee who happened to stay longer than expected. The courtroom in Dallas, Texas, was unusually quiet that morning. Sandra sat at the plaintiff's table with both hands folded tightly in her lap. From a distance, she looked calm, composed, collected, but anyone sitting close enough would have noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her thumb rubbed against her wedding ring finger out of habit, even though the ring was long gone, the way she swallowed before every deep breath. Across the room sat David Johnson, her husband, or at least for a little while longer. His suit was perfectly tailored, his posture relaxed, his expression confident, almost amused, like a man attending a business meeting he expected to win. David barely looked in Sandra's direction. Instead, he listened as his attorney stood before the judge. "Our position is very straightforward, Your Honor." The attorney adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Johnson did not contribute in any meaningful way to the development of the company. Sandra stared forward. The words weren't new. She had heard variations of them for months. Still, hearing them spoken inside a courtroom felt different, more permanent, more dangerous. The attorney continued. The success of the business was solely the result of Mr. Johnson's work, leadership, and decision-making. David nodded once, slowly, confidently, as though every word belonged there, as though history itself could be rewritten if enough people repeated the same story. Sandra lowered her eyes for a moment. Not because she believed him, not anymore, but because she remembered exactly where all of this had started. A crowded room, a celebration, a laugh, and one sentence that changed everything. She was easy to replace. The memory hit her like it had happened yesterday. For a second, the courtroom faded away. The judge disappeared. The attorneys disappeared. Even David disappeared. All Sandra could hear was that sentence, those 4 words, simple, cruel, dismissive, easy to replace, and that is where this story begins. Not with a divorce, not with a courtroom, not even with a marriage. It begins with a question. Have you ever helped someone build something from the ground up, only to watch them act like you were never there? Have you ever stayed up late helping somebody chase a dream, encouraged them when they wanted to quit, believed in them when nobody else did, only to discover they had quietly erased your name from the story? Because that is exactly what happened to Sandra. And what made it worse was this. The person rewriting history wasn't a stranger, it wasn't a rival, it wasn't an enemy, it was the man she loved, the man who once promised they were building everything together, the man who stood beside her and talked about forever, the man who now sat only a few feet away pretending her sacrifices never mattered. But here's the question that kept everyone wondering. What happens when the person controlling the story also controls the narrative everyone believes? What happens when the lie becomes more popular than the truth? And what happens when the one person who knows everything finally decides to speak? Stay with me. Because before this courtroom was over, before the judge made a decision, before David Johnson realized how much trouble he was truly in, a woman nobody expected to become the most important witness in the room would walk through those doors. And when she finally spoke, the entire case changed. But before we get there, welcome to Mr. Gray Family, a storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark, and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video DS. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons, it's all here wrapped in immersive narration that can you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. And before we continue, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever been overlooked by someone you helped? If you have, comment. I know my worth. Also, take a second to like this video. It helps more people discover these stories, and it tells YouTube that this community matters. Now let's go back to the beginning. Back before the courtroom. Back before the divorce. Back before David Johnson decided the woman who helped build his dream was easy to replace. Because the truth is, Sandra Johnson wasn't just part of the story. She was one of the reasons the story existed at all. Long before courtrooms, long before business success, long before Sandra Johnson found herself questioning everything she had sacrificed. She was simply Sandra, a girl growing up in Dallas, Texas. The neighborhood where she spent most of her childhood wasn't wealthy. Nobody pretended it was. People worked hard. Some worked 2 jobs, some worked night shifts, some spent years trying to create better opportunities for their children. But despite the challenges, there was something special about the community. People looked out for each other. If someone's car broke down, neighbors showed up. If a family experienced a difficult season, meals appeared at their door. If someone celebrated a birthday, graduation, promotion, or a new baby, everybody somehow found a reason to gather. Sandra grew up surrounded by that kind of environment. She learned very early that success wasn't something people achieved alone. It was something people built together. Some of her favorite memories came from family gatherings. Those gatherings never felt small. Music filled every room. Food covered every table. Conversations happened everywhere at once. Adults laughed loudly. Children ran through the house pretending the living room was a playground. Somebody was always telling a story. Somebody was always singing. And somebody was always reminding everyone to grab another plate before the food disappeared. Sandra loved those moments. Not because of the food, not because of the music, because of the feeling that people mattered, the feeling that nobody had to face life alone. As she grew older, those lessons stayed with her. She became the person people naturally trusted. Friends called when they needed advice, relatives called when they needed help. Coworkers called when they needed someone dependable. Sandra rarely said no, not because she wanted praise. Actually, she often felt uncomfortable receiving attention. She simply believed helping people was what decent people did. By her mid-20s, that reputation followed her everywhere. People described her using similar words: kind, reliable, thoughtful, loyal. One friend once joked that Sandra probably had a harder time disappointing strangers than most people had disappointing family. Sandra laughed when she heard it, but secretly she knew there was some truth to it. She cared deeply about people, sometimes more deeply than they realized, sometimes more deeply than she should have. Still, she never viewed that quality as a weakness. To Sandra, relationships were the most valuable thing a person could have. Jobs changed, money came and went, opportunities appeared and disappeared. But genuine relationships stayed, at least that was what she believed. When she wasn't working, she often spent time helping organize local events, community functions, celebrations, fundraisers, neighborhood gatherings. She enjoyed bringing people together. There was something satisfying about watching complete strangers arrive at an event and leave feeling connected. Sandra had a natural ability to make people feel comfortable. She remembered names, remembered details, remembered conversations from months earlier. People appreciated that, because in a world where everyone seemed busy, Sandra made people feel seen. One evening after helping organize a community event, she sat with several relatives while they cleaned up folding tables and packed supplies into storage bins. The event had lasted hours. Everyone was tired, but the conversation continued anyway. One of her relatives looked around the nearly empty venue and smiled. "You know what I like about you, Sandra?" Sandra laughed. "That sounds dangerous." "It isn't." The relative pointed toward a group of volunteers gathering chairs. "You always help people without calculating what you'll get back." Sandra shrugged. "I don't think everything needs a reward." The relative nodded. "Most people say that. Not everybody means it." Sandra didn't respond immediately. She simply watched people cleaning up together. Nobody was being paid. Nobody expected recognition. They were helping because somebody needed help. To her, that was normal, natural, the way life was supposed to work. What Sandra couldn't have known at that moment was that those beliefs would one day be tested more than she ever imagined, because eventually she would meet someone whose dreams were enormous, someone whose ambitions stretched far beyond anything she had experienced, someone she would support with every ounce of loyalty she possessed. And for a long time, she would believe he valued those sacrifices as much as she did. Back then, though, the future felt far away. The courtroom didn't exist yet. The company didn't exist yet. The heartbreak didn't exist yet. Sandra was simply living her life, trusting people, believing the best in them, carrying the lessons she learned from family, community, and years spent helping others. Those lessons shaped the woman she became, and they would eventually shape every decision she made when love entered her life. That love arrived when she least expected it, and his name was David Johnson. Sandra met David Johnson on an ordinary evening that didn't feel important at the time. Years later, she would look back and realize how strange that was. The biggest moments in life rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly. A conversation, a handshake, a smile. Then suddenly, everything changes. The event where they met was held in Dallas. Sandra had volunteered to help coordinate portions of the gathering, something she often did whenever organizations needed extra support. She spent most of the evening moving from one task to another, greeting guests, helping with schedules, making sure things stayed organized, the kind of work she enjoyed, the kind of work most people barely noticed. David was attending for entirely different reasons. He wasn't there to volunteer. He wasn't there to socialize. He was there to make connections. Even then, ambition seemed to follow him everywhere. At 31, David carried himself with a confidence that naturally attracted attention. Not arrogance. Not yet. Just confidence. He spoke with purpose, walked with purpose, planned everything with purpose. Sandra noticed him long before they actually spoke, mostly because he seemed different from everyone else in the room. While many guests bounced from conversation to conversation, David listened carefully whenever someone spoke. He asked questions, remembered details, focused completely on whoever stood in front of him. It was a small thing, but Sandra appreciated small things. Their first conversation happened near the refreshment table. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just two people talking. David smiled. "You look like you've been running this place all night." Sandra laughed. "It feels that way." "You organized all this?" "Not all of it. Just helping where I can." David glanced around the room. "Well, whoever planned it did a good job. Thank you." Something about the exchange felt easy, natural, no awkward pauses, no forced jokes. Just conversation flowing in a way that surprised both of them. They spent nearly 30 minutes talking before either realized how much time had passed. By the end of the evening, David asked if she wanted to meet for coffee sometime. Sandra hesitated for half a second, then smiled. "I'd like that." The first date lasted nearly 4 hours. Neither planned for it to. They simply kept talking. One topic led to another, then another, then another. By the time they finally stood to leave, the coffee shop was preparing to close. David laughed. "I think we accidentally stayed all day." Sandra smiled. "I think you're right." As their relationship developed, their differences became obvious, but surprisingly, those differences brought them closer. Sandra came from a family-centered environment where people shared everything: advice, problems, successes, failures. Life happened together. David's upbringing was different. His family valued independence, self-reliance, achievement. Conversations were often shorter. Emotions were usually more private. At first, Sandra found the contrast fascinating. David felt the same way. They often joked about it. One evening during dinner, David listened as Sandra described a family gathering involving dozens of relatives. He stared at her. "Wait. What? You mean everybody actually stayed all day?" Sandra laughed. "Of course. Voluntarily." She nearly choked on her drink. "David, they're family. My family would have needed a detailed schedule." That became one of their favorite running jokes. The differences never felt threatening. They felt refreshing. Each offered something the other lacked. David admired how easily Sandra connected with people. Sandra admired David's determination. When David set a goal, he pursued it relentlessly. That focus impressed her. It also inspired her. Before long, they began taking short road trips around Texas. Nothing expensive, nothing extravagant. Just weekends spent exploring small towns, local restaurants, roadside attractions, and long stretches of highway. Those drives became some of their happiest memories. Hours passed while they talked about everything: childhood memories, future plans, personal fears, career goals. The conversations never felt rushed. Sometimes they drove with music playing softly in the background. Sometimes they talked the entire trip. One afternoon, while watching the sunset from a roadside overlook, David became unusually quiet. Sandra noticed immediately. "What are you thinking about?" David stared toward the horizon. "The future." Sandra smiled. "That sounds serious." "It is." He paused, then looked at her. "I don't want to spend my life building someone else's dream." Sandra listened carefully. David continued. "One day I want my own company." The statement wasn't surprising. Even then, ambition was woven into who he was. "What kind of company?" Sandra asked. David began explaining his ideas, his goals, his vision. The excitement in his voice was impossible to miss. For nearly an hour he talked about possibilities, challenges, plans. Sandra watched him the entire time. Not because she understood every business detail, because she believed him. She could see how much it mattered. And there was something powerful about watching someone speak passionately about a future they hadn't reached yet. When David finally stopped talking, he laughed. "Sorry, I got carried away." Sandra shook her head. "No. What? I like hearing you talk about it." "Really?" "Really." For a moment neither said anything. The evening air felt calm, comfortable. David looked at her and smiled. "You know, most people tell me to be realistic." Sandra smiled back. Maybe realistic isn't always the right answer. That response stayed with him. Over the following months, their relationship deepened. The attraction remained strong. But something more important began growing beneath it: trust. They started sharing bigger pieces of themselves, not just their successes, their insecurities, their doubts, their disappointments, the things people usually keep hidden. David trusted Sandra with his dreams. Sandra trusted David with her heart. Without realizing it, they were building something far more important than romance. They were building partnership, the kind of partnership that made both of them believe they could face anything together. And before long, that belief would be tested. Because David wasn't content talking about his business ideas anymore. He wanted to turn them into reality. And when that moment arrived, both of their lives would change. The decision finally came on a Tuesday evening. Sandra remembered the day because David had spent the entire week acting distracted. Not distant, not withdrawn, just unusually focused. The kind of focus that made him stare at a wall while thinking through 10 different possibilities at once. They were sitting in the living room of their small Dallas apartment when David closed his laptop and looked at her. His expression immediately told Sandra something important was coming. "What?" she asked. David leaned forward. "I think I'm ready," Sandra smiled. "For what?" "To start the company." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Not because the idea was shocking. They had talked about it countless times. But talking about a dream and acting on it were completely different things. This was no longer a possibility. It was becoming reality. Sandra saw both excitement and uncertainty in David's eyes. The confidence was still there, but so was fear, real fear, the kind that comes when everything you've imagined is suddenly within reach. "You mean now?" Sandra asked. David nodded. "Now." Sandra sat quietly for a second. Then she smiled. A genuine smile, the kind that instantly eased the tension in the room. "Then let's do it." David laughed. "That's it? What? I just told you I'm about to leave stability behind and start a business." Sandra shrugged. "You've been talking about this for years." "Yeah, so why would I act surprised?" David shook his head and laughed again. One thing he loved about Sandra was her ability to simplify complicated moments. Where other people saw risk, she saw possibility. Where other people focused on what could go wrong, she focused on what could go right. That support mattered more than he realized. Especially during the months that followed. Because once the company officially launched, reality arrived quickly, very quickly. The early days were difficult. Much more difficult than either of them expected. Money became tight almost immediately. Some months felt manageable, other months felt terrifying. There were weeks when every unexpected expense seemed determined to arrive at the same time. Bills, equipment costs, marketing expenses, operating costs. The numbers never stopped. Sandra still worked her regular job during the day. That paycheck became one of the most important sources of stability in their household. Meanwhile, David spent nearly every waking hour trying to grow the business. Some mornings started before sunrise, some nights ended after midnight, and despite all that effort, progress often felt frustratingly slow. The apartment reflected their situation: small, modest, functional, nothing glamorous. The furniture didn't match, the kitchen was cramped, the living room doubled as a workspace, the bedroom sometimes felt like an extension of the office, but neither of them complained much. They were too busy trying to make the dream survive. One of Sandra's favorite memories from those years happened almost every night. The kitchen table became headquarters. Dinner plates would disappear. Then paperwork would arrive. Invoices, contracts, business plans, client information, notes, spreadsheets, folders, more folders. Soon the entire table looked less like a place to eat and more like the control center of a growing company. One evening, Sandra walked into the kitchen and stared at the mountain of paperwork. David looked up from his laptop. "What?" Sandra pointed at the table. "I'd like to officially file a complaint." David smiled. "About what?" "Our dining room has been kidnapped." He laughed. "What are you talking about?" "I haven't seen an actual table in 3 weeks." David looked around dramatically. "You make a strong argument." "I know. Unfortunately, the company has occupied the property." Sandra pulled out a chair. "Then I want rent." That became another running joke between them. Moments like those helped balance the pressure, because there was plenty of pressure, more than most people ever saw. David wasn't the only one sacrificing. Sandra's workload kept growing too. After finishing her own job each day, she often spent evenings helping with company responsibilities. At first, the tasks seemed small: organizing schedules, tracking information, coordinating meetings, managing communication. But over time, those responsibilities expanded. Sandra discovered she had a natural ability to connect people. Relationships came easily to her. Networking felt natural. Building trust felt natural. People enjoyed talking with her, and those qualities started helping the business. When Sandra attended events, she met people. When she met people, conversations happened. When conversations happened, opportunities sometimes followed. Little by little, connections developed, potential clients, professional contacts, business introductions. Some opportunities led nowhere, others became valuable. David noticed, and unlike years later, during these early stages, he openly acknowledged her contributions. Often, one night after a particularly productive week, they sat together reviewing company updates. The numbers still weren't impressive. The company was far from successful, but progress existed, real progress. David leaned back in his chair. "You know something?" Sandra looked up. "What?" "I couldn't do this without you." She smiled. "Sure you could." "No." He shook his head. "I'm serious." Sandra laughed softly. "You're giving me too much credit." David immediately disagreed. "No, I'm not." He pointed toward the paperwork spread across the table. "This." Then toward her. "And this." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Very professional explanation." David laughed, but then his expression softened, and his next words came from a place of complete sincerity. "We're building this together." Sandra felt warmth spread through her chest, not because of the business, not because of the company, because she believed him, completely. Those words became part of their relationship. Whenever challenges appeared, whenever stress increased, whenever setbacks happened, David always returned to the same reminder: we're building this together. And every time he said it, Sandra believed him. Why wouldn't she? His actions matched his words. His gratitude felt genuine. His appreciation felt real. The company was still small. Success was still uncertain. The future remained unpredictable. But one thing felt absolutely certain. They were a team, partners, two people working toward the same goal. Neither of them knew what the coming years would bring. Neither knew how successful the company would become. Neither knew how dramatically life would change. At that moment, all they knew was this: a dream was finally taking shape, and they were building it side by side, exactly as they had promised. For a long time, Sandra and David measured progress differently than most people. They didn't celebrate expensive purchases. They didn't chase luxury. They didn't spend much time comparing themselves to anyone else. Progress meant surviving another month, landing another client, paying another bill, taking one more step forward. That mindset stayed with them when they finally got married. The wedding wasn't extravagant. Neither of them wanted it to be. The people who mattered most were there. Family members filled the room with laughter and conversation. Friends celebrated alongside them. The music was good. The food disappeared quickly. And for one evening, nobody talked about business plans, invoices, or company goals. It was simply a celebration of two people who genuinely loved each other. Sandra still remembered standing beside David during the reception. He looked happier than she had ever seen him. Not because of the company, not because of money, because of her. At one point during the evening, David quietly squeezed her hand. Sandra looked at him. "What?" David smiled. "Nothing." "That's not a real answer." He laughed. "Fine." Sandra waited. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am." She rolled her eyes playfully. "You practiced that speech, didn't you?" "No." "You definitely practiced it." David laughed again, and for a few seconds they simply enjoyed the moment. No pressure, no deadlines, no uncertainty, just happiness. The months following the wedding settled into a comfortable rhythm. The company continued operating. Sandra continued helping whenever she could. David continued chasing growth. Some weeks brought encouraging news. Other weeks brought disappointment. The progress remained steady but slow. Very slow. Sometimes it felt as though the business moved forward 1 inch at a time. A new client would arrive. Then another challenge would appear. Revenue would improve. Then unexpected expenses would erase the improvement. The cycle repeated itself constantly. Still, neither of them lost faith. David remained determined. Sandra remained optimistic. They believed persistence would eventually pay off, and eventually it did. The first major breakthrough arrived quietly. A larger client signed on, then another, then another. For the first time, the company wasn't merely surviving. It was growing. The difference became noticeable almost immediately. Cash flow improved. Opportunities increased. Conversations about survival slowly transformed into conversations about expansion. David seemed energized. More energized than ever. Sandra enjoyed seeing him that way. After years of uncertainty, she felt proud watching his hard work produce results. The growth continued. Month after month, year after year. The company developed a stronger reputation. People within the industry began recognizing David's name. Partnership opportunities expanded. Contracts became larger. The business moved into a different phase, One where success no longer felt hypothetical, it felt real. Sandra remembered visiting the office one afternoon and realizing how much had changed. The company no longer resembled the operation they had built from a tiny apartment. Employees moved through hallways. Meetings filled conference rooms. Phones rang constantly. Schedules stayed packed. The atmosphere felt alive. David walked beside her, clearly proud. "You remember when it was just us?" Sandra smiled. "And a kitchen table." David laughed. "Yeah." They stood for a moment watching employees work. Neither said much. They didn't need to. The growth spoke for itself. As the company expanded, more employees joined the team. Then even more. Departments developed. Responsibilities increased. New opportunities appeared regularly. The business that once struggled to stay afloat had become something significant. The financial changes followed naturally. For the first time in years, money stopped being a constant source of stress. Sandra noticed it in small ways. Bills no longer caused anxiety. Unexpected expenses no longer felt like emergencies. Planning for the future became easier. The relief was enormous. Not because Sandra cared deeply about wealth, because stability felt good. After years of uncertainty, stability felt like a reward they had earned together. The company's growing reputation also brought a new level of prestige. Industry events, professional recognition, networking opportunities, invitations that never would have existed during the early years. David became increasingly visible within business circles. People sought his advice, requested meetings, praised his leadership. Sandra watched all of it with genuine pride. Whenever someone complimented David, she smiled. Whenever another success arrived, she celebrated with him. Whenever another milestone appeared, she remained exactly where she had always been, supporting him, encouraging him, believing in him. From Sandra's perspective, this was the future they had worked toward. The dream was becoming reality. The sacrifices seemed worth it. The long nights seemed worth it. The uncertainty seemed worth it. Everything appeared to be moving in the right direction. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. What Sandra didn't realize yet was that success was beginning to change more than the company. It was beginning to change David. Slowly, quietly, in ways that would take time to fully understand. At first, the changes were so small that Sandra almost missed them. There was no dramatic moment, no single conversation, no obvious turning point. If someone had asked her when David started changing, she wouldn't have known how to answer. Because it happened gradually, one habit at a time, one decision at a time, one attitude at a time. The success they had worked so hard to achieve kept growing. The company expanded, new opportunities arrived. David's schedule became increasingly demanding. At least that was how Sandra explained things in the beginning. Whenever he missed dinner, she blamed the workload. Whenever he arrived home late, she blamed the workload. Whenever he seemed distracted during conversations, she blamed the workload. It felt like the reasonable explanation. After all, David had responsibilities now. Employees depended on him. Clients depended on him. The company demanded more attention than ever before. Sandra understood that. She had supported him through every stage of the journey. She wasn't expecting life to remain exactly the same. Still, little things started catching her attention. Small things. The kind of things that don't seem important by themselves. One evening they attended a business event together. Years earlier, David would have spent most of the evening introducing Sandra to people, including her in conversations, making her feel like a partner. That night felt different. Not rude, not openly disrespectful, just different. Sandra noticed how carefully David selected which conversations deserved his attention. He seemed less interested in connecting with people and more interested in evaluating them. Who could help? Who had influence? Who had access? Who could create opportunities? As they drove home, Sandra looked out the passenger window. The city lights moved past them. Finally, she spoke. "You seem busy tonight." David kept his eyes on the road. "It was a good event." Sandra nodded. "It was." A few seconds passed. Then she asked carefully, "Did you enjoy it?" David looked surprised by the question. "Of course." "I don't know." "What do you mean?" Sandra searched for the right words. "You used to talk to everybody." David laughed softly. "That's because I didn't know anybody. And now? Now I have to be more strategic." Strategic. The word stayed with her, not because it was wrong, because it felt unfamiliar. David used to value relationships for the people involved. Now he seemed increasingly focused on what those relationships could produce. Sandra didn't argue. She simply listened. Over the following months, similar moments appeared more often. David became increasingly concerned with appearances, the way events looked, the people attending them, the status attached to them. Conversations about business sometimes sounded different too. Less personal, more calculated, more focused on outcomes and connections, Sandra noticed, but she said very little, partly because she didn't want to create conflict, partly because she wasn't entirely sure what she was seeing, and partly because she still loved him. Love has a way of making people patient, sometimes wonderfully patient, sometimes dangerously patient. Around the same time, another change began affecting their marriage. Date nights slowly disappeared, not all at once. One cancellation here, one postponement there, then another, then another. At first, David always apologized. "I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. Things are just busy right now." Sandra believed him. Most of the time he sounded sincere, but eventually she stopped making reservations altogether. It felt easier than watching plans fall apart. One Friday evening, she arrived home carrying takeout from one of their favorite restaurants. Years earlier, that would have guaranteed a fun evening, a simple dinner, a movie, conversation, time together. Instead, she found David working at the dining table, his laptop open, phone beside him, several documents spread around him. Sandra set the food down. "You forgot." David looked up. "What?" "Dinner." His expression changed immediately. "Oh." The single word told her everything. For a moment, he genuinely hadn't remembered. "I am so sorry." Sandra forced a smile. "It's okay. No, really, it's fine." But it wasn't fine. Not because of the dinner, because of what the dinner represented. She missed him, not physically, emotionally. The distance between them felt harder to explain than any argument would have been. Arguments have clear causes, clear moments, clear explanations. This felt different. Like watching someone slowly walk farther away without realizing they were moving. The conversations became shorter too. That bothered Sandra more than she expected. Years earlier they could spend hours talking. About anything. Everything. Now many conversations seemed rushed, interrupted, incomplete. One night they sat together on the couch after dinner. Sandra tried sharing a story about a community event she had helped organize. Halfway through, she noticed David checking emails on his phone. She stopped talking. A few seconds passed. David looked up. "What happened?" Sandra stared at him. "What? You stopped." David glanced at his phone, then back at her. Understanding appeared on his face. "Oh." Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, David set the phone down. "I'm listening." But Sandra wasn't sure he had been, and somehow that hurt more than she wanted to admit. She tried ignoring those feelings, tried convincing herself they were temporary, tried believing things would improve once business pressure settled down. Yet another part of her quietly wondered if this was simply who David was becoming. The thought made her uncomfortable, because acknowledging it would require asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. Questions about the marriage, questions about the future, questions about whether success was changing the man she fell in love with. Sandra wasn't ready for those conversations, so she kept moving forward, supporting him, encouraging him, showing up the same way she always had, even as she began feeling increasingly alone inside a marriage that once felt like a partnership. And the hardest part was this. David didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he never mentioned it, which left Sandra carrying those feelings by herself, hoping things would return to the way they used to be, not realizing that an even more painful change was already beginning, one that would strike at something far deeper than loneliness. It would strike at her place in the story they had built together. Sandra tried to ignore it at first. In fact, she became very good at explaining things away. Whenever something felt uncomfortable, she found a reason for it. Whenever something seemed unfair, she gave it the benefit of the doubt. She told herself that successful people lived under constant pressure. She told herself that leadership came with responsibilities she couldn't fully understand. Most importantly, she told herself that David would never intentionally hurt her. That belief survived longer than it should have. The first time Sandra noticed something unusual, it happened during a small business gathering in Dallas. Nothing formal, nothing particularly important. A few industry professionals, a few clients, the kind of event where people exchanged ideas and built relationships. Sandra attended because she had always attended. For years, she had been part of the journey. Being there felt natural. During the evening, one of the guests congratulated David on the company's growth. David thanked him. The conversation continued. More compliments followed. More praise. Sandra stood beside him, smiling politely. Then the guest asked a simple question. "So how did you manage to grow so quickly?" David immediately launched into an explanation. He discussed strategy, planning, leadership decisions, market opportunities, business development. Sandra listened. At first, nothing felt unusual. Then she realized something. David never mentioned her, not once. The conversation ended. The guest moved on. Sandra said nothing. The omission seemed small, easy to overlook. Maybe David had simply answered the question quickly. Maybe he hadn't thought about it. Maybe she was reading too much into it. That was the explanation she chose. Months later, something similar happened again, then again, then again. The pattern became harder to ignore. Whenever people discussed a company's history, David increasingly told the story as though he had built everything alone. Not directly, not aggressively. He simply stopped including certain details. Details that once mattered. Details that happened to involve Sandra. One evening, they attended a professional awards event. The company received recognition for its growth and success. Sandra felt genuinely proud. She remembered the difficult years, the uncertainty, the sacrifices, the countless nights spent helping however she could. Watching the company receive recognition felt rewarding. David eventually stepped onto the stage to accept the award. The audience applauded. Sandra joined them. A smile appeared on her face as she watched him approach the microphone. David thanked several people. Employees, business partners, mentors, professional contacts. The speech continued. Sandra waited, and waited, and waited. Her smile remained, but something inside her slowly shifted. Because her name never came. Not once. The applause eventually filled the room again. David returned to his seat. Everyone congratulated him. Sandra congratulated him too. She even hugged him. But during the drive home, the silence inside the car felt heavier than usual. David noticed it. "You okay?" Sandra looked out the window. "Yeah, you seem quiet. I'm fine." The answer wasn't entirely honest, but neither was she ready for the conversation sitting in her chest. Part of her felt hurt. Another part felt guilty for feeling hurt. After all, wasn't the award about the company? Wasn't David the face of the business? Wasn't she supposed to be supportive? Those questions followed her for weeks. Unfortunately, the incidents kept coming. At networking events, people praised David's vision. David accepted the compliments. At conferences, people discussed the company's success. David accepted the compliments. At interviews, people highlighted David's accomplishments. David accepted the compliments. And increasingly, he stopped correcting anyone. Years earlier, he would have immediately acknowledged Sandra's role. Now those acknowledgments seemed to disappear. The most confusing part wasn't what other people believed. The most confusing part was David's silence. Sandra wasn't demanding public recognition. She wasn't chasing attention. That had never been her personality. What bothered her was the gradual rewriting of history. The story itself was changing, and somehow she seemed to be fading from it. One evening, Sandra sat alone scrolling through an article featuring David and the company. The piece discussed the business journey, the challenges, the growth, the achievements. Several moments sounded familiar, painfully familiar, because Sandra remembered living them. Yet reading the article felt strangely disconnected. Important pieces were missing. The article described David overcoming obstacles. The article described David building relationships. The article described David creating opportunities. Everything revolved around David. Sandra stared at the screen for a long moment, then quietly set her phone down. A strange feeling settled over her. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to disappointment. The kind that arrives when reality begins conflicting with what you want to believe. When David arrived home later that evening, Sandra almost brought it up. Almost. The conversation sat right there, waiting. But when she looked at him, exhausted from another long day, she stopped herself. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe another time. Maybe she was still overthinking everything. That became her habit. Postponing uncomfortable conversations, giving situations more time, offering more understanding, offering more patience, offering more grace. Sandra continued supporting David. She attended events, encouraged him, celebrated victories, listened when he needed to vent. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. But internally, something was changing. The loneliness from earlier had started evolving into something else. Doubt. Not doubt about her value, at least not yet. Doubt about her place in David's life. Doubt about her place in the story they had created together. And that doubt became harder to ignore with every passing month. Because eventually a moment was coming that would force Sandra to confront a painful truth. A moment where David would stop merely leaving her out of the story. He would openly tell people how little he believed she mattered, and once those words were spoken, there would be no way to pretend everything was fine anymore. Before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever stayed loyal longer than you should have? Have you ever kept giving someone understanding while they slowly stopped appreciating what you brought into their life? Let me know in the comments. And if this story is speaking to you so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Gray Family, because the next chapter is where everything changes. The celebration that should have honored years of hard work becomes the night Sandra hears the sentence that destroys her marriage. The company's 8th anniversary celebration was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of Sandra Johnson's life. For weeks, she treated the event as if it were a family milestone. In many ways it was. The company had survived difficult years. It had overcome uncertainty. It had grown from a dream discussed in a small apartment into a successful business respected throughout the region. Even though Sandra was no longer involved in daily operations the way she once had been, old habits remained. When something mattered to David, it mattered to her. That had always been true. So when preparations for the anniversary celebration began, Sandra naturally stepped in to help. Not because anyone asked her to, because she wanted to. The event would bring together important clients, investors, business partners, and employees. People who had played a role in the company's growth. People David wanted to impress. Sandra understood how important appearances could be during events like these. Every detail mattered. The atmosphere, the timing, the guest experience, the little things people remembered after they went home. She spent days reviewing schedules, checking arrangements, coordinating details, and making sure everything flowed smoothly. The work felt familiar, almost comforting. For a brief period, it reminded her of the earlier years, the years when she and David operated as a team, the years when every success felt shared. One afternoon, only a few days before the celebration, Sandra stood inside the venue while final preparations were underway. The location was one of the most elegant event spaces in Dallas. High ceilings stretched above the ballroom. Large chandeliers reflected warm light across polished floors. Round tables filled the room, each one carefully arranged, every place setting perfectly aligned. Staff members moved efficiently through the venue making final adjustments. Sandra slowly walked through the ballroom, examining details, making notes, fixing small issues before anyone else noticed them. As she worked, she couldn't help smiling. The transformation amazed her. Years earlier, she and David had worried about paying bills. Now they were preparing for an event that celebrated 8 years of business success. The contrast felt incredible. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You look happy." Sandra turned. David had just entered the ballroom. He adjusted his jacket while looking around the room. Sandra laughed. "Can you blame me?" David followed her gaze. The room looked beautiful. Even he seemed impressed. "No," he admitted, "I can't." For a moment they stood side by side, looking at everything they had helped create. Or at least that was how Sandra still viewed it. She looked at David. "Nervous?" David smiled. "A little." "Good." He laughed. "Good. Absolutely." Sandra crossed her arms. "If you're nervous, it means you still care." David shook his head. "I don't know where you come up with these things. You married me." Fair point. For a brief moment the conversation felt like old times. Easy, comfortable, natural. The kind of exchange she missed. The kind of exchange that used to happen every day. As the celebration approached, guests began confirming attendance. The list grew more impressive with every passing day. Major clients, respected investors, industry leaders, successful entrepreneurs, employees from every stage of the company's history. The event wasn't merely a celebration, it was a statement, proof that David's company had become something significant. Sandra knew how much that meant to him. And despite the growing distance in their marriage, she genuinely wanted him to enjoy the night. He had worked hard, no one could deny that. The evening finally arrived. The venue looked even more impressive than Sandra imagined. Soft music filled the ballroom. Conversations echoed throughout the room. Guests arrived dressed in formal attire. Laughter blended with the sounds of glasses clinking together. The atmosphere felt warm, energetic, successful. Sandra moved through the crowd greeting people she recognized. Many guests remembered her. Several stopped to talk. Others thanked her for helping organize such a beautiful event. Sandra appreciated the compliments. But most of all, she enjoyed watching the company celebrate its accomplishments. Everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of growth. Employees discussing projects, clients sharing stories, business relationships that had developed over years. The company had become a community of its own. As the evening progressed, David naturally became the center of attention. People surrounded him constantly, offering congratulations, sharing memories, celebrating milestones. Sandra watched from a distance several times throughout the night, and despite everything that had happened recently, she felt proud of the journey, proud of the success, proud of what had been accomplished. Maybe that was why she ignored the small feeling in the back of her mind, the feeling that something still wasn't right, the feeling she couldn't quite explain. Because tonight wasn't supposed to be about problems. It was supposed to be about celebration, about gratitude, about looking back on how far they had come. Sandra believed that. She wanted to believe that. which was exactly why she never expected the most painful moment of her marriage to happen before the evening was over. At that point, she was still smiling, still hopeful, still proud, completely unaware that a single conversation was about to change everything. The evening continued exactly as Sandra expected. Guests moved comfortably through the ballroom. Servers carried trays through clusters of conversations. Music played softly in the background. Everywhere she looked, people seemed to be enjoying themselves. For most of the night, Sandra stayed busy. Someone always needed directions. Someone wanted information. Someone had a question. Old habits took over. She naturally stepped in wherever she could help. Several people thanked her for helping coordinate such a successful event. She accepted the compliments politely and moved on. The recognition wasn't important. Seeing everything come together was enough. At least she thought it was. A little later in the evening, Sandra decided to step away from the ballroom for a few minutes. She wasn't upset. She wasn't looking for anyone. She simply wanted a quiet moment. The main celebration had become crowded, and she needed a brief break from the noise. She walked down a hallway connected to a private lounge area used for smaller conversations throughout the night. As she approached the entrance, she heard familiar voices. David was inside. He appeared to be speaking with several investors. Sandra slowed her pace. Not because she intended to listen. She had no reason to. The conversation simply drifted into the hallway before she reached the doorway. At first, she smiled. The group sounded relaxed, comfortable. Several people were laughing. David seemed to be enjoying himself. Then she heard one of the investors say something that immediately caught her attention. "You know," the investor said, "your wife deserves some credit too." Sandra stopped walking. The conversation continued. The investor smiled toward David. 8 years is a long journey. You don't build something like this without support at home. Another investor nodded. Absolutely. Most people don't see the sacrifices spouses make during those early years. Sandra remained where she was, still hidden from view, still listening, and for one brief moment something warm settled inside her chest, not because she wanted praise, but because somebody understood. Somebody recognized that success stories rarely belong to one person. They belong to everyone who helps carry the weight. She waited to hear David's response, expected him to say something simple, something kind, maybe even something honest. Instead, David laughed, a genuine laugh. Not uncomfortable, not embarrassed, not nervous. The sound immediately felt wrong. Sandra frowned. Then David spoke. People always say that. Another investor chuckled. "What, that your wife helped?" David shook his head. "They make it sound like she made some massive sacrifice." Sandra's stomach tightened. The investor looked surprised. "What do you mean?" David took a sip from his drink, then shrugged. "Honestly?" The group waited. David smiled. "Anybody could have filled that role." The hallway suddenly felt smaller. Sandra froze. For a second she wondered if she had misunderstood. Maybe she missed part of the conversation. Maybe there was context she didn't hear. Maybe. Then David continued, and removed all doubt. She was easy to replace. Silence, not in the lounge. People there continued talking, laughing, drinking. The silence happened inside Sandra. Everything seemed to stop. The music from the ballroom faded. The conversations faded. Even the sounds from the hallway seemed distant. She simply stood there, motionless, trying to process what she had just heard, easy to replace. The words landed with a force she wasn't prepared for, because they didn't come from a stranger. They didn't come from an enemy. They came from David, the same man who once sat beside her in a tiny apartment talking about dreams, the same man who once thanked her for every contribution, the same man who repeatedly told her they were building something together. Sandra stared at the wall across from her. Her breathing became shallow, not dramatic, not obvious, just different, the kind of breathing people do when they're trying very hard not to react. Inside the lounge, the conversation continued. One investor laughed awkwardly. "I'm not sure my wife would appreciate hearing that." The group chuckled. David laughed too, as if everything was harmless, as if the woman they were discussing wasn't a real person, as if years of support could be reduced to a position anyone could have occupied. Sandra felt her throat tighten. What hurt most wasn't the insult itself. It was the certainty behind it. David wasn't speaking impulsively. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defending himself during an argument. He was speaking freely, comfortably, confidently. These weren't words chosen in frustration. They were words he genuinely believed. And somehow that realization hurt more than anything else. Sandra quietly stepped backward, then another step, then another. The last thing she wanted was for anyone to see her standing there. She turned and walked back toward the ballroom, slowly, carefully, as though moving too quickly might cause everything around her to shatter. The celebration continued exactly as before. People smiled, people laughed, people congratulated David. Nothing had changed. Except everything had changed. Sandra moved through the crowd almost automatically. She greeted people, answered questions, smiled when necessary. Nobody noticed the difference. Or if they did, they didn't mention it. At one point, someone complimented the event. Sandra thanked them. Another guest discussed the company's success. Sandra nodded politely. A third person praised David's leadership. Sandra smiled, the same smile she had used all evening. But it no longer reached her eyes, because now every compliment carried a different meaning. Every celebration felt different. Every success looked different. The entire night had been built around appreciation, around achievement, around recognizing the journey. Yet the person she loved had just erased her from that journey with a single sentence. Not privately, publicly, casually, as though her contributions were insignificant, as though her sacrifices were interchangeable. Sandra eventually found herself standing near one side of the ballroom, away from most of the crowd. Her hands rested quietly around a glass she hadn't touched in nearly 20 minutes. She stared toward the center of the room, toward David. He was smiling, laughing, accepting congratulations, looking completely comfortable. For the first time in their relationship, Sandra saw him differently. Not because she suddenly stopped loving him, because she suddenly stopped recognizing him. And standing there, surrounded by music, celebration, and applause, Sandra realized something painful. The loneliness she had been feeling for months wasn't her imagination. The missing acknowledgments weren't accidents. The disappearing contributions weren't oversights. They were clues. Clues pointing toward a truth she had desperately avoided. David didn't just fail to appreciate her. He no longer valued what she had given. And before the night ended, she was going to ask him directly, because after hearing those words, silence was no longer an option. Sandra waited, not because she was unsure what she wanted to say, because she knew exactly what she wanted to say. The problem was that she wasn't sure what would happen once the conversation started. For the remainder of the celebration, she kept her distance from David. Not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough to create space between herself and the man she suddenly felt she didn't know. The event eventually began winding down. Guests started leaving, goodbyes were exchanged, final conversations stretched across the ballroom, employees coordinated cleanup. The energy that had filled the room all evening slowly faded. David remained in a good mood. Sandra noticed it immediately. He laughed with departing guests, thanked people for attending, accepted congratulations. From the outside, he looked like a man ending one of the best nights of his life. Sandra looked like a woman trying to hold herself together. The drive home felt unusually quiet. David eventually noticed. "You okay?" Sandra kept her eyes forward. "Do I look okay?" The question caught him off guard. What does that mean? Sandra turned toward him. For the first time all evening, she looked directly at him. Really looked at him. And David immediately sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked. Sandra stared at him for a few seconds. Then she looked away again. "We'll talk when we get home." The remainder of the drive passed in silence. Not angry silence. Something heavier. The kind of silence that settles between two people when one of them already knows a line has been crossed. By the time they arrived home, Sandra's emotions had become remarkably clear. The shock was gone. The confusion was gone. What remained was hurt. Deep hurt. The kind that arrives when someone you trust reveals how they truly see you. David placed his keys on the counter. "Okay." Sandra stood near the living room, waiting. "What happened?" For a second, neither moved. Then Sandra spoke. "I heard what you said." David frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The investors." His expression changed slightly. Not enough to reveal guilt, but enough to reveal recognition. Sandra noticed, immediately. "The conversation in the lounge." A pause, a brief one, then David sighed. Understanding settled across his face. "Oh." Just one word. "Oh." Not shock, not concern, not panic. As though he had simply realized which conversation she meant, Sandra stared at him. "That's all you have to say?" David rubbed the back of his neck. "Sandra." "No." She shook her head. "No. Start with this." Her voice remained calm, almost too calm. "Did you mean it?" David hesitated. The hesitation answered more than any words could. Sandra's eyes narrowed. "Did you mean it?" Another pause. Then David exhaled slowly. "I think you're taking it too personally." Sandra laughed. A short, painful laugh. "Too personally?" "Sandra, You called me easy to replace. I was joking. No, you weren't. David immediately looked frustrated. You don't know the context. Then explain the context. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there wasn't one, not a reasonable one, not one capable of making those words acceptable. Sandra waited. David eventually looked away, and that silence told her everything. For years she had defended him, explained his behavior, given him the benefit of the doubt. Tonight she was watching the excuses disappear, one by one. Finally David crossed his arms. You want honesty? Sandra nodded. Yes, fine. His voice hardened. And with that single shift in tone, the conversation moved somewhere neither of them could take back. You act like you built the company. Sandra blinked. What? David continued. You do. Her face registered genuine disbelief. Are you serious right now? You constantly act like the business wouldn't exist without you. For a moment Sandra simply stared, trying to understand what she was hearing. Then she shook her head slowly. That's not true. Really? No. David laughed without humor. Come on, Sandra. The laugh hurt almost as much as the words, because it sounded dismissive. The same way he had sounded in the lounge. The same way he had sounded when discussing her with investors. Sandra folded her arms. I never said the company existed because of me. David stepped forward. But you act like your role was equal. The room became very quiet, painfully quiet. Sandra looked at him as though seeing him for the first time. Equal? Yes. The word came without hesitation, without uncertainty, without reflection. Sandra felt something shift inside her. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to heartbreak, because David genuinely believed what he was saying. Years of history suddenly stood between them. The apartment, the sacrifices, the extra work, the networking, the support, the endless nights helping however she could. And somehow David had reduced all of it to this. You really think that? Sandra asked quietly. David shrugged. I built the company. The sentence hung in the air. Sandra's eyes never left his. You built it alone? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. David's frustration continued growing. You're twisting my words. No, Sandra's voice finally cracked, just slightly. I'm listening to them. The emotion surprised both of them. For a moment neither spoke. Then Sandra took a slow breath. When things were difficult, where was I? David said nothing. When there wasn't enough money, where was I? Still nothing. When you needed help, where was I? David looked away. Sandra nodded slowly. Exactly. He knew the answers. The problem wasn't knowledge. The problem was gratitude. Or more accurately, the absence of it. David eventually spoke again. But instead of stepping back, he moved further into the argument. You helped. Sandra stared at him. But let's not pretend you were running the company. The words landed hard, because they weren't entirely false. Sandra never claimed she ran the company. That wasn't the issue. The issue was what David was refusing to acknowledge. Contribution, partnership, sacrifice. The things that don't appear on organizational charts but still matter. The things he once appreciated. The things he now seemed determined to minimize. The conversation continued deep into the night. Neither raised their voice much. Strangely, that made it worse. The argument wasn't fueled by anger, it was fueled by truth, or at least the truths each of them believed. Sandra learned how little David valued her role. David revealed years of resentment she never knew existed. Every response widened the distance between them. Every explanation made reconciliation feel less possible. By the time exhaustion finally replaced conversation, neither looked at the other the same way. The marriage hadn't ended that night. Not officially. There were no lawyers yet. No court filings, no legal paperwork. But something essential had broken, something neither of them could repair simply by apologizing. The foundation itself had cracked. Over the following weeks, the tension remained. Conversations became strained. Silences became longer. The distance continued growing. Neither seemed capable of finding a path back. And eventually, the conversation shifted from saving the marriage to ending it. The divorce process began months later. What hurt Sandra most wasn't the possibility of losing the relationship. That pain was already there. What hurt most was realizing that the man she had spent years supporting no longer saw their history the same way she did. The partnership she believed in, the sacrifices she made, the role she played. David was slowly rewriting all of it, and soon he would try to convince an entire courtroom to believe that version too. But there was one thing neither of them knew yet. Someone had been quietly watching the story unfold for years. Someone who knew exactly what Sandra had contributed. someone who knew exactly how much history was being erased, and when the time came, that person would have a choice to make: stay silent or tell the truth. The divorce process began quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no public spectacle, no moment where Sandra suddenly felt free. Instead, it arrived through paperwork, appointments, conversations she never imagined having, and decisions she never expected to make. Months had passed since the anniversary celebration, months since the conversation that fractured her marriage, months since she realized David no longer viewed their shared history the way she did. By then, both of them had accepted a difficult reality. The marriage wasn't recovering. Too much had been said. Too much had been revealed. The trust that once held everything together no longer existed. Sandra tried focusing on practical matters. She returned her attention to work, spent time with family, kept herself busy. From the outside, she appeared composed, but internally she was carrying questions she couldn't seem to escape. Questions about the past, questions about her role in the company, questions about whether she had misunderstood her own importance. Those doubts grew stronger once attorneys became involved. The first few meetings felt overwhelming. Sandra quickly discovered that divorce wasn't only about emotions, it was about narratives, competing versions of the same history, each side presenting a story, each side defending that story. And the story David's legal team intended to tell shocked her. At first, Sandra assumed there would be disagreements about details. That seemed normal. People remembered events differently. People interpreted situations differently. She expected some conflict. What she didn't expect was complete erasure. One afternoon, Sandra sat across from her attorney reviewing documents related to the case. Stacks of paperwork covered the table: financial records, business information, legal filings. The discussion remained professional, routine, until one particular document appeared. Sandra reached for it, read the page, then read it again. Her expression changed immediately. The attorney noticed. "You okay?" Sandra continued staring at the document, slowly, carefully, trying to make sense of what she was reading. Finally, she looked up. "What is this?" The attorney remained calm. "It's part of their position." Sandra laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because she couldn't believe it. Their position? The words felt absurd. The document essentially presented Sandra as a spouse who happened to be nearby while David built a company. Nothing more. No meaningful contribution, no business impact, no significant involvement, just presence. Sandra lowered the paper. For several seconds she couldn't speak. The attorney waited patiently. Eventually, Sandra shook her head. "This can't be serious." Unfortunately, it was. Very serious. As more documents appeared, the pattern became impossible to ignore. David's legal strategy wasn't simply minimizing her role, it was eliminating it. The distinction mattered. Minimizing suggested some contribution. Eliminating suggested none. Sandra left the meeting carrying a heaviness she hadn't felt before. The anniversary comments hurt. The argument hurt. The divorce hurt. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. Like watching someone systematically remove pieces of your life from the historical record. The following weeks became increasingly difficult. Every new filing seemed to reinforce the same message. David built the company. David created the opportunities. David developed the relationships. David carried the burden. Sandra simply existed nearby. Reading those claims over and over began affecting her more than she expected. Not because she believed them, at least not initially. But repetition has power, especially when it comes from official documents, especially when attorneys present those claims with confidence, especially when the person making those claims once knew you better than anyone else. Sandra started revisiting old memories, the apartment, the networking events, the client introductions, the late nights, the planning sessions, the sacrifices. She remembered them clearly. Yet a small voice inside her began asking uncomfortable questions. What if she was remembering them differently? What if she had exaggerated her role without realizing it? What if David genuinely believed everything he was saying? The questions frustrated her, because another part of her immediately pushed back. She knew what happened. She lived it. She remembered it. Still, the doubt lingered. One evening, Sandra sat alone in her living room looking through old photographs. Images from earlier years, images from before success, complicated everything. She studied one picture for a long time. She and David stood together smiling beside one of the company's earliest promotional displays. The memory felt vivid, the excitement, the uncertainty, the teamwork. Back then, neither of them talked about ownership. They talked about partnership. Sandra looked at the photograph, then set it aside. A few moments later, she wiped away tears she hadn't realized were forming. Not because she missed the marriage, not entirely, because she missed certainty. She missed knowing where she stood. She missed believing her contributions mattered. For the first time since the divorce began, Sandra found herself questioning something she had never questioned before, her own value. And that made this chapter of her life far more painful than any courtroom battle ever could. What Sandra didn't know was that while she struggled with those doubts, someone else had been carrying a very different burden. Someone who had watched the company's history change in real time. Someone who knew the records weren't telling the whole story. Someone who had remained silent for years. Her name was Nia Carter, and she was approaching a decision that would change everything. Nia Carter never expected to become part of Sandra and David's story. For years, her role had been simple. Show up, do her job well, go home. That was enough. She wasn't interested in office politics. She wasn't interested in personal drama. And she certainly wasn't interested in becoming involved in anyone's divorce. Yet the longer she worked beside David, the harder it became to ignore what she was seeing. Nia had joined the company during its growth years. Not at the very beginning, but early enough to witness how the business evolved. Early enough to hear stories about the difficult years, early enough to understand how much effort had gone into building the company. From her first weeks on the job, one thing became clear. Sandra's name appeared everywhere. Old emails, planning discussions, client correspondence, scheduling records, networking contacts, historical files. Sandra wasn't merely connected to the company because she was married to David. She was connected because she had actively participated in its development. Nia noticed it almost immediately. At first, it didn't seem remarkable. Many small businesses relied on support from spouses during the early years. That wasn't unusual. What stood out was how often Sandra appeared in the company's history. The deeper NIA worked within the organization, the more examples she found. Client introductions, event planning support, relationship building efforts, early business opportunities. Sandra's influence existed throughout the records. The evidence wasn't hidden, at least not then. It was simply part of the company's story. Back in those years, David spoke about Sandra differently too. Nia remembered that clearly. When people discussed the company's beginnings, David occasionally mentioned Sandra's support. Not constantly, but naturally, without hesitation, without discomfort. It seemed normal, honest, the kind of acknowledgement people offer when they appreciate someone. Over time, however, something began changing. The shift happened gradually, so gradually that most people probably wouldn't have noticed. Nia did, because details were part of her job. She paid attention. One afternoon, she was preparing materials for an upcoming presentation. Nothing unusual, just another routine assignment. As she reviewed older records, she noticed something strange. Several references to Sandra had disappeared from newer versions of company materials. At first, Nia assumed the changes were administrative. Perhaps someone simplified the presentation. Perhaps certain details were removed to save space. That explanation made sense, until it kept happening, again and again and again. Years passed. More presentations were updated. More historical summaries were revised. More company narratives were adjusted. Each individual change seemed small, almost insignificant. Yet the overall pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. Sandra's role appeared smaller every year. Not because new information emerged, because old information quietly disappeared. Nia never forgot one particular example, a business relationship that proved extremely valuable during the company's early development. The original records clearly showed how the connection formed. The details were straightforward, easy to follow. Sandra's networking efforts played a role in creating the opportunity. The documentation reflected that. Later versions of the same company history looked different, not dramatically different, just enough to shift attention elsewhere, enough to make Sandra's involvement less visible, enough to change how people understood the story. Nia stared at those records longer than she should have. Something about them bothered her. Not because she was personally invested, because accuracy mattered, facts mattered, and the facts seemed increasingly flexible depending on who was telling the story. As years passed, the pattern continued. David's public image grew stronger, his reputation expanded, industry recognition increased, the company became more successful. At the same time, Sandra's connection to that success became less visible. Whenever Nia noticed it, she told herself the same thing. Stay out of it. This isn't your business. You're here to work. Not judge, not interfere, just work. That mindset helped for a long time. After all, Nia had responsibilities, bills, commitments, career goals. Like most people, she couldn't casually risk her livelihood, so she remained silent, even when she felt uncomfortable, even when she questioned certain decisions, even when she suspected the public version of events wasn't entirely accurate. Silence felt safer, and safety often wins, at least temporarily. The anniversary celebration changed that. Not immediately, but something shifted afterward. Word travels quickly inside companies. especially after major events, especially after marriages begin falling apart. Eventually, Nia learned enough to understand what happened. She learned about the conversation, the comments, the damage, the divorce. And once the legal process began, she started noticing something familiar, the same pattern she had been watching for years. Only now it was happening on a larger scale, much larger. Documents presented a version of history that felt increasingly incomplete. Contributions disappeared. Context disappeared. Important details disappeared. Nia found herself revisiting old records, reviewing archived materials, looking at information she hadn't examined in years. Every review left her more uncomfortable, because she knew something important. The record still existed, the history still existed, the truth still existed. The problem was that very few people knew where to find it. One evening, Nia remained at the office long after most employees had left. The building felt unusually quiet. She sat alone reviewing archived materials, email chains, historical documents, internal records. The evidence was there, not hidden, not fabricated, simply forgotten, or perhaps ignored. Nia leaned back in her chair, exhaustion mixed with frustration. For years she had convinced herself remaining silent was the responsible choice. Now she wasn't so sure, because silence wasn't neutral anymore. Silence was helping one version of history replace another, and the realization became harder to live with every day. For the first time, Nia seriously considered doing something she had avoided for years, getting involved. The thought scared her, more than she wanted to admit, because speaking up carried consequences, real consequences, professional consequences, personal consequences. Comfort would disappear, life would become complicated. Nia understood all of that. Yet despite those risks, another thought kept returning. What if the greater mistake was staying silent? That question followed her home, followed her through weekends, followed her through sleepless nights. And eventually, it would lead her toward a decision she could no longer avoid, a decision that would place her directly in the center of a battle she never wanted to join, because the truth was still sitting inside those records, waiting. And before long, Nia Carter would have to decide whether protecting her comfort mattered more than protecting the truth. The decision didn't happen in a single moment. There wasn't one dramatic discovery, no sudden revelation, no emotional speech delivered in front of a mirror. For Nia Carter, the decision formed slowly, piece by piece, day after day. The more she thought about everything she had witnessed, the harder it became to justify doing nothing. For years, remaining silent had felt practical, reasonable, safe. Now it felt different. Now it felt like participation. That realization followed her everywhere, at work, at home. During ordinary moments when her mind should have been focused elsewhere, she kept returning to the same question. What happens when someone knows the truth but chooses convenience instead? The answer became increasingly uncomfortable. Because Nia knew something important. Sandra wasn't fighting over credit. Sandra wasn't trying to rewrite history. If anything, the opposite was happening. Someone else was rewriting it, and the records proved it. One evening, after another long day, Nia sat alone reviewing archived company materials. The office was mostly empty. The quiet allowed her to focus. Folders covered her desk. Digital records filled her computer screen. Years of company history sat directly in front of her. The deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. Sandra's contributions weren't difficult to find. In fact, they appeared repeatedly. Emails documenting introductions, planning discussions, client communications, meeting notes, networking opportunities. The evidence stretched across multiple years, different situations, different circumstances, different stages of the company's growth. Each document revealed another piece of the same reality. Sandra had contributed, meaningfully, consistently, and in some cases, critically. Nia stared at one collection of records longer than the others. A series of communications connected to an important business relationship from the company's earlier years. She reviewed them carefully, then reviewed them again. The timeline was clear. The connection existed because Sandra helped create it. The records left little room for interpretation. Without that opportunity, the company's trajectory might have looked very different. Nia leaned back in her chair. The evidence wasn't weak. It wasn't speculative. It wasn't based on opinion. It was documentation, and that distinction mattered, because opinions can be dismissed. Documents are harder to ignore. The realization finally pushed her toward a decision. Not because she wanted conflict, because she no longer felt comfortable watching the truth disappear. A few days later, Nia found herself holding her phone longer than necessary. The contact information sat in front of her. Simple, accessible. One call, one conversation, one choice, and everything would change. She almost talked herself out of it. More than once, the risks were obvious. Once she became involved, there would be no returning to normal. Her role would become known. Questions would follow. Consequences might follow. People rarely enjoy becoming part of legal disputes. Nia was no exception, yet every argument in favor of silence eventually ran into the same obstacle. The truth. The truth remained exactly where she left it, inside the records, inside the emails, inside the history everyone seemed eager to forget. Finally, she made the call. The conversation was professional, careful, measured. Nia wasn't interested in exaggeration. She wasn't interested in taking sides. She simply explained what she knew. And what she knew immediately captured attention. The attorney listened closely, asked questions, requested clarification. Nia answered honestly, nothing more, nothing less. As the discussion continued, the significance of the information became obvious. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't speculation. Evidence existed. Real evidence. Documented evidence. Evidence capable of establishing a timeline. Evidence capable of verifying contributions. Evidence capable of challenging the version of history being presented in court filings. For the first time since the divorce began, a different possibility emerged. The possibility that facts might speak for themselves. Over the following days, additional conversations took place. Records were reviewed, information was organized, historical materials were examined carefully. The process remained methodical, professional, deliberate. And with every document that surfaced, the same picture became clearer. The company's story had always been larger than one person, much larger. Nia provided access to archived emails, communications preserved over multiple years, records that many people probably assumed nobody would ever revisit. Yet there they were, still existing, still accurate, still telling the same story they told when they were first created. Additional materials followed, meeting notes, business correspondence, historical records connected to important company decisions, documentation reflecting relationships that helped create opportunities, piece after piece, page after page. The foundation of the case slowly changed. Sandra didn't know every detail immediately. At first, she simply learned that someone had come forward, someone with information, someone willing to help establish what actually happened. Even that news felt difficult to process. For months she had been defending her memories. Now, actual records existed to support them. The effect was powerful, not because it guaranteed victory, because it challenged the doubt that had been growing inside her. For the first time in a long while, Sandra felt something she hadn't felt during the divorce process. Relief. Small relief. Careful relief. But relief nonetheless. Meanwhile, Nia continued cooperating despite the uncertainty ahead. The choice wasn't easy. It never became easy. There were moments when she questioned herself. Moments when she wondered whether remaining silent would have been simpler. Of course it would have been simpler. The problem was that simple and right aren't always the same thing. Eventually Nia accepted a reality she could no longer avoid. Comfort wasn't the most important thing. Integrity was. And integrity required action, not because Sandra needed a hero, not because Nia wanted attention, because facts matter, truth matters, history matters, especially when someone tries to rewrite it. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. What would you do if telling the truth could cost you something important? Would you stay quiet to protect your own peace, or would you speak up even if it made life harder? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mr. Gray Family. Because in the next chapter, everything comes full circle. The courtroom returns, the evidence finally appears, and the story David spent years controlling is about to face the one thing it cannot outrun, the truth. The courtroom looked smaller than Sandra expected. That thought surprised her. After months of preparation, months of legal filings, and months of wondering how everything would end, she somehow imagined a larger room, a more dramatic setting. Instead, the courtroom felt ordinary, quiet, professional, controlled. Yet despite its simplicity, Sandra understood something important. The outcome of this room would affect the next chapter of her life. She sat beside her attorney and tried to steady her breathing. The morning had started early. She barely touched breakfast. Sleep had been difficult the night before. Not because she feared the truth, because she feared uncertainty. There was a difference. Sandra knew what happened during those years. She knew the sacrifices she made. She knew the role she played. The problem was proving it. And after months of hearing David's version of events repeated through legal filings, part of her still worried about what would happen if nobody believed her. Across the room sat David Johnson. He looked exactly the way Sandra expected him to look. Calm, confident, composed. His posture remained relaxed. His suit was immaculate. His expression revealed no concern. From a distance, he looked like a man attending another business meeting, not someone fighting over the history of a marriage. Not someone facing evidence capable of challenging his entire narrative. Sandra studied him for a moment, then looked away. There was no anger in her expression, only disappointment. The kind that remains long after arguments end. The kind that survives after love changes shape. David spoke occasionally with his attorneys. Short conversations, quiet conversations. Every now and then he nodded while reviewing documents. Nothing about his behavior suggested concern. In fact, he appeared comfortable, as though everything was proceeding according to plan. Sandra noticed it. Her attorney noticed it too. Neither commented. There was no point. The hearing eventually began. The judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat. The formal process moved forward. Arguments were presented. Documents were discussed. Legal language filled the room. Sandra listened carefully. Some portions felt familiar. Others felt strangely detached. Months of preparation had reduced years of life into evidence, timelines, and legal positions. At one point, David's side again emphasized the same argument. Sandra's contributions had been minimal. Her involvement had been limited. The company's success belonged almost entirely to David. Hearing those claims still hurt. But something felt different this time. The doubt wasn't as strong as before, because now Sandra knew something David didn't. The records existed. The emails existed. The history existed. And somewhere inside that courthouse, the person who knew exactly where to find those records was preparing to speak. The morning continued. More documents appeared. More arguments followed. Then a subtle shift moved through the room. Sandra noticed it immediately. So did David. A door opened. Several people glanced toward the entrance. And Nia Carter entered the courtroom. The reaction wasn't dramatic. Nobody gasped. Nobody interrupted the proceedings. Yet the atmosphere changed all the same. Sandra felt it. David felt it. Even from across the room, she could see the brief flicker of recognition in his face. It disappeared quickly, but not quickly enough. For the first time all morning, David looked less certain. Not frightened, not defeated, just less certain. Nia remained calm, professional, the same way she had always carried herself. She wasn't there for attention. She wasn't there for revenge. She wasn't there to create a spectacle. She was there because facts matter. Sandra watched her take her place. A strange mixture of gratitude and nervousness settled inside her, because although she knew evidence existed, she had not yet seen everything. She didn't know exactly what records would appear. She didn't know how powerful they would be. She didn't know how the judge would respond. All she knew was that the truth was finally entering the room, and once it arrived, nobody would be able to pretend it didn't exist. The first documents were prepared. The first records were organized. The foundation for Nia's testimony began taking shape, piece by piece, page by page. The story David had spent months presenting was about to face something it had successfully avoided until now: verification. And as the evidence started moving toward the judge's bench, Sandra realized that this hearing was no longer about competing memories. It was about facts. And facts were much harder to erase. The courtroom became noticeably quieter once Nia Carter took the stand, not because anyone announced that something important was about to happen. Because people could feel it. Months of claims, months of arguments, months of competing stories had led to this moment. And unlike opinions, testimony supported by records had weight. Into her seat and answered the initial questions calmly. Her voice remained steady, professional, measured. Nothing about her demeanor suggested hostility. She wasn't trying to attack David. She wasn't trying to defend Sandra. She was there to explain what she knew. And what she knew came directly from years of observation and documentation. Sandra sat perfectly still. Her hands rested in her lap. She listened carefully. Across the courtroom, David's expression remained controlled, but the confidence he displayed earlier seemed less effortless now. The first questions focused on Nia's role within the company, her responsibilities, her access to records, her familiarity with company history. The foundation mattered. Every answer established credibility. Every answer reinforced the same point. Nia wasn't guessing. She wasn't relying on distant memories. She worked with the information directly. Then the discussion shifted. Records began appearing, one document at a time, one timeline at a time, one piece of evidence at a time. The first collection involved client acquisition records from the company's earlier years. Nia carefully explained what the documents showed, how certain relationships began, how opportunities developed, how connections were established. The records reflected details that stretched back years, important details, details that had largely disappeared from the version of events David's legal team presented. The judge reviewed the materials carefully. Questions followed. Nia answered each one clearly, without exaggeration, without emotion, just facts. Sandra felt her heartbeat quicken, because for the first time since the divorce process began, she wasn't hearing arguments. She was hearing proof. Then came another set of records. Networking documentation, historical correspondence, communication records connected to business opportunities. Nia explained how various introductions occurred, how certain professional relationships formed, how opportunities entered the company's orbit. Again and again, Sandra's involvement appeared within the records, not as a bystander, not as someone merely present nearby, as an active participant. The distinction mattered, and the documents reflected that distinction repeatedly. David remained silent, but Sandra noticed him reviewing papers more frequently now. His attorneys exchanged occasional comments, short conversations, quick observations. The certainty that filled the room earlier seemed harder to find. The testimony continued. Emails followed, dozens of them, archived communications preserved across multiple years. Some discussed introductions, others discussed event planning. Others documented relationship-building efforts that helped create business opportunities. Each message represented a moment from the past, a moment that no longer depended on memory. Because the records still existed, the judge spent considerable time reviewing portions of the correspondence. The courtroom remained attentive, not because the emails were dramatic, because they were specific. Specificity matters, especially when people disagree about history. One email led to another, then another, and another. A clear pattern emerged. Sandra's contributions weren't isolated incidents. They appeared consistently, across different years, different projects, different situations. The evidence painted a picture far more complete than the one David's legal team had presented. Nia then discussed meeting notes preserved within company records, planning discussions, business conversations, documentation tied to important decisions. The notes revealed collaboration, participation, involvement. Again, Sandra's name appeared, not occasionally, repeatedly. Each appearance carried significance, because every documented contribution made complete erasure more difficult to defend. Sandra felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief, not triumph, not revenge, relief. For months she questioned herself, questioned her memories, questioned her value. Now she was watching years of doubt meet years of documentation, and the documentation was winning. One of the most important moments arrived when attention shifted toward a client relationship connected to the company's earlier struggles. The records established a clear timeline, a connection formed, conversations followed, opportunities developed. Eventually, a significant business relationship emerged. Nia carefully explained the sequence. The judge listened closely. Sandra listened closely. David listened closely. The documentation showed something important. Sandra's networking efforts helped create the original connection. Without that connection, the opportunity may never have existed. Without the opportunity, the company's path forward might have looked very different. The significance of that evidence settled across the courtroom. Not dramatically, not emotionally, factually, and facts often speak louder than arguments. The testimony continued for some time, record after record, document after document, piece after piece. No single document changed everything. That wasn't the power of the evidence. The power came from consistency. Years of records pointing in the same direction, years of documentation supporting the same conclusion, years of history refusing to disappear. Sandra looked down briefly, not because she was overwhelmed, because she needed a moment. For so long she had wondered whether anyone would acknowledge what actually happened. Now the acknowledgement was occurring in the most official setting possible, not through kindness, not through sympathy, through evidence. When she finally looked up again, her eyes moved toward the judge. The attention remained fixed on the records, focused, careful, thoughtful, exactly as it should be. The hearing wasn't about emotions, it was about reality, and reality was becoming increasingly difficult to dispute. By the time Nia's testimony neared its conclusion, the version of history David spent months promoting no longer looked nearly as strong. Not because someone attacked, because documentation challenged it. The difference mattered. Sandra realized that as she sat quietly listening. The truth didn't need dramatic speeches. It didn't need revenge. It didn't need anger. It simply needed the opportunity to be seen. And finally, after all this time, it was. For the first time since the divorce began, Sandra wasn't defending her worth. The records were doing it for her. And that changed everything. When the legal process finally ended, Sandra expected to feel celebration. Instead, she felt something quieter. Peace. Not complete peace, not immediate peace, the kind that arrives after carrying a heavy weight for a very long time and finally setting it down. The courtroom battle had never been about proving David was a bad person. It had never been about public embarrassment. And despite everything that happened, Sandra found herself surprisingly uninterested in revenge. What she wanted was truth, nothing more, nothing less. And in the end, truth had finally been acknowledged. The settlement reflected reality, not the version of history that erased her, not the version that reduced years of sacrifice to mere proximity. Reality, the documented contributions, the business relationships, the work, the support, the role she genuinely played, the outcome mattered. But the financial portion wasn't what stayed with Sandra. Money could solve certain problems. It could not restore lost trust. It could not undo painful conversations. It could not rebuild a marriage. What stayed with her was something much more important: validation. For months she had questioned herself, questioned memories she once considered certain, questioned whether she had somehow exaggerated her own importance. Now she no longer needed to wonder. The evidence answered those questions, clearly, permanently, and that answer gave her something David could no longer take away: confidence in her own truth. The divorce eventually became official. The final paperwork was completed. Signatures were provided. The legal chapter of their lives ended. Sandra expected the transition to feel dramatic. It didn't. Life rarely changes all at once. Most changes happen gradually, one ordinary day at a time. The weeks following the divorce felt unfamiliar. For years, much of Sandra's identity had been connected to partnership, connected to marriage, connected to helping build something alongside someone she loved. Now she faced a different challenge: learning who she was without that role. At first, the process felt uncomfortable. There were quiet evenings, unexpected emotions, moments when old memories surfaced without warning. Some days felt easier than others. Some days felt heavier. But little by little, Sandra started rebuilding. Not the life she had before. A new life. One built on lessons she had earned. She returned her attention to event planning, something she always enjoyed, something she was genuinely talented at. The work felt familiar, natural, and for the first time in years she approached it entirely on her own terms. Clients appreciated her professionalism. People trusted her. Opportunities appeared steadily. Before long, Sandra expanded into consulting work as well, helping organizations improve events, helping businesses strengthen relationships, helping people create meaningful connections. The same skills that once helped a growing company now helped her build something for herself, and there was satisfaction in that. Not because she was trying to prove anything, because she was finally investing the same energy into her own future. Outside of work, she began reconnecting with parts of herself that had been neglected for years, friends she hadn't seen enough, family gatherings she sometimes missed, community events she once loved attending. The connections that shaped her early life gradually returned to the center of her world. One evening, many months after the divorce became final, Sandra attended a community event in Dallas. Music filled the venue. Conversations flowed naturally from one group to another. People laughed. Stories were exchanged. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. As Sandra moved through the crowd, several people stopped to greet her. Some asked about work. Others shared updates about their own lives. The conversations felt easy, comfortable, authentic. At one point she stepped aside and simply watched the room for a moment. A familiar feeling settled over her. Not sadness, not regret, gratitude. The realization surprised her, because if someone had asked her during the divorce whether gratitude was possible, she probably would have said no. Yet here it was, not gratitude for the pain, not gratitude for the betrayal. Gratitude for what she learned about herself, for what she survived, for the confidence she rebuilt, for the understanding she gained. Sandra smiled quietly. For the first time in a very long time, she wasn't standing in the background of someone else's success story. She wasn't being introduced as someone's wife. She wasn't measuring her worth through another person's recognition. She was simply Sandra Johnson, and that felt beautiful, because the most important lesson from her journey had nothing to do with courtrooms, nothing to do with settlements, nothing to do with winning or losing. It was this: a person's value does not disappear when someone refuses to acknowledge it. Value exists whether it is recognized or not. Truth exists whether it is celebrated or not. Character exists whether it receives applause or not. David's opinion never created Sandra's worth, which meant his opinion could never destroy it. That truth had always existed. Sandra simply needed to remember it, and perhaps that is why her story matters. Not because someone was proven wrong, because someone finally remembered who they were. Before the doubt, before the disappointment, before another person's version of events tried to define them. Sometimes justice is not about getting even. Sometimes justice is about moving forward with dignity. And Sandra did exactly that. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Mr. Gray Family, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what's one lesson you learned from Sandra's journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember this: never allow someone else's story about you to become more powerful than the truth you know about yourself, because your worth does not begin when someone notices it. and it does not end when someone doesn't.